Van Helsing is a 2004 American dark fantasy action-adventure film that was written and directed by Stephen Sommers, a filmmaker known for blending old-school monster mythology with modern blockbuster spectacle. The film was produced under Sommers' own production banner in partnership with Bob Duxay, and it was distributed worldwide by Universal Pictures, the very studio that had originally brought Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolf Man to the silver screen back in the 1930s and 40s. In many ways, Van Helsing was Universal's love letter to its own legacy, an attempt to gather all of its classic monsters under one roof and reintroduce them to a new generation of moviegoers who grew up on fast-paced action and heavy visual effects rather than black and white gothic horror. The movie was primarily filmed in the Czech Republic, with its production making extensive use of European castles, forests, and historic locations to recreate the eerie atmosphere of Eastern Europe, alongside soundstage work that allowed Sommers and his team to build massive, elaborate sets depicting Dracula's castle and the cursed village surrounding it. Released in the United States, this film immediately positioned itself as a summer blockbuster with sweeping ambitions, aiming to launch an entire cinematic universe built around Universal's classic monsters long before shared universes became the dominant trend in Hollywood. The story of Van Helsing follows Gabriel Van Helsing, played by Hugh Jackman, a mysterious and highly skilled monster hunter who works in secret for a Vatican organization known as the Holy Order, a group dedicated to protecting the world from supernatural threats that ordinary people cannot even begin to comprehend. Van Helsing suffers from amnesia and does not remember his own past, which becomes an important thread running throughout the film as he slowly uncovers fragments of who he truly is. As the story opens, Van Helsing is dispatched on a dangerous new mission to the dark and superstition-soaked region of Transylvania, where he is tasked with helping the last surviving members of the Valerious family break a centuries-old curse that has plagued their bloodline. This curse prevents any member of the family from entering heaven until Count Dracula himself is destroyed once and for all. In Transylvania, Van Helsing meets Anna Valerious, portrayed by Kate Beckinsale, a fierce and determined warrior princess who has spent her entire life fighting to protect her people and end the suffering that has haunted her family for generations. Anna is initially wary of Van Helsing, given that outsiders have rarely brought anything but trouble to her homeland, but the two quickly form an uneasy alliance as they realize their goals are aligned. Alongside them is Carl, played by David Wenham, a witty and resourceful friar who serves as Van Helsing's technical support, providing him with an array of inventive weapons and gadgets designed specifically to combat the various monsters they encounter. The trio soon discovers that Count Dracula, brought to life with theatrical menace by Richard Roxburgh, has formed a sinister alliance with the reanimated Frankenstein's monster, and is secretly using the creature's unique biology in an attempt to bring his own vampire children to life. Dracula's vampire brides, along with his werewolf servant Velkin, played by Will Kemp, complicate the mission further, as Van Helsing and Anna must navigate a web of betrayal, ancient curses, and shifting loyalties. Velkin, Anna's own brother, becomes infected and transformed into a werewolf, adding a deeply personal and tragic dimension to the unfolding conflict. As the film progresses, Van Helsing himself becomes infected by the werewolf curse during a climactic confrontation, forcing him to embrace his transformed state in order to gain the one weakness capable of destroying Dracula, since werewolves are shown to be among the only creatures able to kill vampires permanently. The story builds toward an explosive final battle inside Dracula's castle, where alliances are tested, sacrifices are made, and the true nature of Van Helsing's forgotten past is finally revealed, tying his personal identity directly to the ancient struggle between good and evil that has defined the entire narrative. The cast of Van Helsing brought together a talented ensemble of performers who each left their mark on the film. Hugh Jackman, fresh off his breakout success as Wolverine in the X-Men franchise, took on the lead role and brought a rugged, brooding intensity to the character, balancing physical action with an underlying vulnerability tied to his character's lost memories. Kate Beckinsale, who had already built a strong reputation in the horror and action genre thanks to her role in Underworld, delivered a performance filled with fire and determination as Anna Valerious, portraying a woman shaped entirely by loss and duty. David Wenham brought comic relief and warmth to the film as Carl, offering a lighter counterbalance to the darker elements of the story. Richard Roxburgh took on the role of Count Dracula with theatrical flair, leaning into the character's charm and cruelty in equal measure. Shuler Hensley portrayed Frankenstein's monster with surprising emotional depth, presenting the creature not simply as a mindless brute but as a being caught between opposing forces who ultimately searches for his own sense of peace. Will Kemp played Velkin, whose tragic transformation adds weight to the family's suffering, while Kevin J. O'Connor portrayed Igor, Dracula's loyal and unsettling servant. Alan Armstrong appeared as Cardinal Jeanette, the head of the Holy Order who oversees Van Helsing's missions, and Elena Anaya, Josie Marin, and Sylvia Kaloka played Dracula's vampire brides, each bringing a distinct and haunting presence to their roles. Samuel West rounded out the cast as Dr. Victor Frankenstein, whose original experiments set the entire chain of supernatural events into motion long before the film's story begins. Van Helsing was released in theaters on May 7, 2004, arriving as one of the major tentpole releases of that summer season. It carried a substantial production budget, reportedly falling somewhere between $160 and $170 million, reflecting the massive scale of its visual effects, elaborate costume design, and extensive location work across the Czech Republic. Despite receiving a mixed reception from critics upon release, with many pointing to its dense plot and overstuffed mythology, the film still managed to perform respectably at the global box office, ultimately earning around $300 million worldwide. Its box office performance, combined with the ambitious world-building Stephen Sommers had put into the project, initially fueled plans for potential sequels and an expanded monster universe, though those plans would eventually be shelved as the years went on. Even so, Van Helsing remains a memorable entry in early 2000s blockbuster cinema, remembered fondly by many fans for its ambitious attempt to reintroduce Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolf Man to a whole new audience within a single sweeping, effects-driven adventure. The night begins not in Transylvania, but in Paris, and it begins in black and white, as though the story itself is reaching back through the decades to remind the audience where all of this trouble truly started. In a laboratory perched high above the rooftops of the city, lightning crashes against tall windows while a wild-haired scientist named Dr. Victor Frankenstein moves frantically among coils of copper wire and crackling machinery. He is a man consumed by obsession, driven not by malice but by an unbearable hunger to conquer death itself, to prove that life could be manufactured rather than simply given. Strapped to a table beneath him lies his creation, an enormous figure stitched together from parts no one wants to think too closely about, waiting for the spark that will drag it into existence. The storm outside intensifies, and at the precise moment lightning strikes the rooftop conductor, energy floods down through the wires and into the creature's body. Its eyes snap open. Its chest rises and falls in ragged, uncertain breaths. The monster lives. But the moment of triumph does not last. Frankenstein's assistant, a small hunched creature named Igor, watches nervously as the villagers below, already suspicious and afraid of what has been happening in the tower above them, begin to gather with torches and pitchforks, certain that something unholy is being conjured in their midst. Before Frankenstein can even begin to understand what he has created, the mob breaks into the laboratory. In the chaos, someone else arrives, a tall, aristocratic figure with pale skin and eyes that seem to hold centuries of hunger behind them. This is Count Dracula, and he has been watching Frankenstein's work with great interest, because he understands something the frightened villagers do not. Dracula needs this creature, needs the secret of its reanimated flesh, for purposes of his own that will not become clear until much later in the story. In the ensuing struggle, Frankenstein is killed, his laboratory set ablaze, and the monster flees into the night pursued by flaming torches and screaming villagers, vanishing into the surrounding hills as the tower collapses behind him. Dracula, furious at having lost his prize, retreats into the darkness as well, and the black and white prologue ends on a note of unfinished business, promising the audience that whatever Dracula wanted from that monster, he has not given up on it. From this shadowy Parisian beginning, the film jumps forward and shifts location entirely, landing us in the heart of Paris once more, though now the story has moved on and color floods back into the frame. Beneath the towering silhouette of Notre Dame Cathedral, a mysterious figure in a wide-brimmed hat and long dark coat moves silently across the rooftops. This is Gabriel Van Helsing, and we see immediately that he is no ordinary man. He carries an arsenal of unusual weapons, moves with the precision of someone who has hunted monsters more times than he can count, and speaks little, letting his actions carry the weight of his character instead. His target this night is Mr. Hyde, the monstrous alter ego of the mild-mannered Dr. Jekyll, who has been terrorizing the city and leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. The confrontation that follows is chaotic and brutal, with Hyde smashing through the cathedral's upper galleries as Van Helsing struggles to subdue him without being torn apart in the process. Van Helsing manages to trap Hyde and ultimately kills him, but the encounter costs him dearly. In the chaos, evidence is left behind that seems to implicate Van Helsing himself in the string of murders Hyde committed, and the citizens of Paris, unaware of the secret war being fought in their city's shadows, brand him a murderer and a monster in his own right. Wounded, exhausted, and now a wanted man in the very city he was trying to protect, Van Helsing has no choice but to flee, his reputation in ruins even though his mission was, in truth, a success. It is here that the true nature of Van Helsing's work is revealed. He does not operate alone or by his own authority. He is the chief agent and enforcer for a secretive Vatican organization known as the Holy Order, a centuries-old brotherhood of monks and knights dedicated to combating supernatural threats that the rest of the world is not equipped, or perhaps not meant, to understand. Deep beneath the Vatican, in a vast underground chamber filled with ancient relics, forbidden texts, and an armory of strange and wonderful weapons designed specifically to kill things that should not exist, Van Helsing is debriefed by Cardinal Genet, the stern but not unkind leader of the order. Genet makes clear that Van Helsing's methods, however necessary, have once again caused problems for the organization's carefully maintained secrecy. Despite this friction, the Cardinal has no choice but to rely on Van Helsing, because he is simply the most capable hunter the Order possesses. We also learn something deeply important and deeply sad about Van Helsing during this sequence. He does not remember who he was before joining the Order. His past is a blank, a void filled only with fragmented images and half-formed sensations that never quite resolve into memory. He does not know his real name, does not know where he was born, does not know why he was chosen for this life of violence and secrecy. All he knows is the mission in front of him, and it is heavily implied, though never stated outright at this point, that his amnesia is no accident, that something happened to him long ago that stripped his memory away and left him as a blank slate the Order was able to shape into their perfect weapon. This mystery hangs over the entire film like a shadow, always present even when the story is racing through action set pieces, because we sense that the truth of Van Helsing's identity will eventually collide with the larger supernatural conflict unfolding around him. Before Van Helsing can rest or recover from the ordeal in Paris, he is given his next assignment, and it is presented to him almost as an afterthought, though it will prove to be the most important mission of his life. He is being sent to Transylvania, to the remote and superstition-steeped village of the Valerious family, where legends claim that Count Dracula himself has made his home for centuries. The Holy Order has learned that the last two surviving members of the Valerious bloodline, a brother and sister, have been fighting a desperate, generations-long war against Dracula and his forces, and that they are close to either succeeding or being wiped out entirely. Van Helsing is ordered to travel there, assess the situation, and provide whatever assistance is necessary to finally end Dracula's reign of terror once and for all. He is joined for this mission by Karl, a nervous but brilliant friar attached to the Order's Science and Weapons Division, whose job is to serve as both quartermaster and reluctant field companion. Karl is immediately unhappy about the assignment, having heard the terrifying stories about Transylvania that have circulated within the Order for generations, but he has little choice except to accompany Van Helsing into the heart of monster country. Their journey takes them across the mountains and forests of Eastern Europe until they arrive at the edge of Transylvania, a land shrouded in mist, fear, and centuries of dark legend. The villagers they encounter along the way are wary of outsiders, having lived their entire lives under the shadow of Dracula's castle looming on a distant peak. It becomes clear very quickly that this is not a land where evil is a distant rumor. It is a lived, daily reality, something the people have learned to endure rather than fight, because fighting has cost them everything for as long as anyone can remember. It is in this atmosphere of dread that Van Helsing first encounters Anna Valerious, and their meeting is anything but friendly. Anna, fierce, guarded, and deeply suspicious of strangers after a lifetime of watching her family and her people suffer, initially mistakes Van Helsing for an enemy and attacks him without hesitation. The two engage in a tense, skillfully choreographed confrontation before misunderstandings are cleared up and Anna realizes that Van Helsing has actually been sent to help her, not harm her. Even so, her trust does not come easily. Anna has learned through painful experience that outsiders who come to Transylvania promising help rarely deliver on that promise, and she has no intention of letting her guard down simply because a stranger claims to be on her side. Anna explains the burden her family has carried for generations. Centuries earlier, one of her ancestors made a terrible mistake, striking a deal or committing a betrayal against Dracula that resulted in a curse being placed upon the entire Valerious bloodline. Under the terms of this curse, no member of the family can enter heaven, no matter how righteously they live or how bravely they die, until Dracula himself is destroyed and the curse is lifted. Generation after generation, Valerious men and women have taken up the fight against Dracula, and generation after generation, they have died in the attempt, their souls trapped in limbo, unable to find peace. Anna and her brother Vulcan are the last of the bloodline, the final chance for their family to break free of this centuries-long torment. The weight of this responsibility has shaped every part of Anna's life, forging her into a warrior with little room left for anything resembling a normal existence. As Van Helsing and Karl settle into the situation, they learn more about the specific nature of the threat they are facing. Dracula is not operating alone in his castle. He commands 3 vampire brides, seductive and monstrous creatures who serve him loyally while also seeming to harbor their own ambitions and resentments beneath the surface of their devotion. Dracula also has numerous other resources at his disposal, and it becomes clear that he is engaged in some larger, more elaborate scheme beyond simply terrorizing the local population. Anna reveals that Dracula has been searching for a way to bring his own children to life, vampire offspring that would allow his bloodline to spread and multiply in ways it never has before, since traditional vampires cannot naturally reproduce in the way ordinary creatures do. This is where the Frankenstein's monster from the film's opening becomes relevant to the present-day plot. Dracula believes that the reanimating energy used to bring Frankenstein's creature to life holds the key to giving true, sustainable life to his vampire offspring, and he has been searching for the monster ever since it escaped into the countryside, understanding that without it, his children will remain stillborn, lifeless things incapable of surviving outside very specific and temporary conditions. Meanwhile, Anna's brother Vulcan has been conducting his own investigation into a related threat. The village has been suffering from a series of brutal attacks that do not match Dracula's usual methods, attacks that suggest the presence of a werewolf prowling the countryside. Vulcan sets out to track down the source of these attacks, determined to protect his people and uncover whatever connection this werewolf might have to Dracula's larger plans. His investigation leads him into increasingly dangerous territory, and it becomes evident that Dracula has been deliberately cultivating a werewolf servant, using the creature as a weapon and as a tool in whatever grand design he is pursuing. Van Helsing, Karl, and Anna form an uneasy alliance, each bringing different skills and knowledge to the table. Karl proves invaluable despite his constant nervousness, providing Van Helsing with inventive weaponry specifically designed to combat vampires and other supernatural threats, including mechanical crossbows, silver ammunition, and other devices drawn from centuries of accumulated knowledge within the Holy Order's archives. Anna, meanwhile, guides them through the treacherous landscape of her homeland, sharing knowledge about Dracula's habits, his castle, and the various dangers that populate the surrounding territory, knowledge earned through a lifetime of loss and vigilance. The trio's investigation eventually leads them toward a masquerade ball being held at Dracula's castle, an elaborate and eerie affair populated by aristocratic guests who may or may not be entirely human. Van Helsing and Anna infiltrate the gathering, moving carefully among the glittering crowd as they attempt to learn more about Dracula's plans without revealing their true purpose. The atmosphere of the ball is thick with tension, gothic opulence mixing uneasily with an undercurrent of predatory menace, as though every smiling face in the room might be concealing fangs behind painted lips. During this sequence, Van Helsing comes face to face with Dracula himself for the first time, and the two engage in a charged, almost theatrical exchange, each sizing up the other, aware that they represent opposing forces locked in an ancient and inevitable conflict. Dracula, ever charming and dangerously eloquent, seems almost amused by Van Helsing's presence, treating him less as a genuine threat and more as an entertaining diversion, though there are hints that he recognizes something familiar, something unsettling, in the hunter's face. The infiltration inevitably goes wrong, as these things always do, and Van Helsing and Anna are forced to fight their way out of the castle as Dracula's vampire brides attack in a frenzy of claws, fangs, and shrieking fury. The vampire brides, when angered or hunting, transform from their elegant human-seeming forms into grotesque, bat-like creatures with leathery wings and monstrous faces, and the sequence showcases the full horror of what they truly are beneath their seductive exteriors. Van Helsing and Anna manage to escape the castle, but not without cost, and the encounter makes clear just how dangerous their mission has become. Around this point in the story, tragedy strikes closer to home. Velkin, still hunting the werewolf that has been terrorizing the countryside, finally comes face to face with the creature, only to be bitten and infected during the struggle. The werewolf's bite is not merely a wound, it is a curse of its own, one that will transform Velkin into a monster with each rise of the full moon. Anna, devastated by what has happened to her brother, refuses to give up on him, desperately searching for any possible way to save him or reverse the curse before it fully takes hold. This subplot adds a deeply personal, almost unbearable weight to the story, transforming the fight against Dracula from a broad and personal war between good and evil into something intimate and painful, a family's last members trying desperately to save each other even as forces beyond their control conspire to tear them apart. As Velkin's transformation progresses, the full horror of his condition becomes clear during a harrowing sequence in which he changes into a werewolf for the first time in front of Anna and Van Helsing, his body contorting and twisting in agony as fur, claws, and fangs erupt from what was once an ordinary man. The transformed Velkin is a creature of pure animal ferocity, no longer able to recognize his sister or control his violent impulses, and the confrontation that follows is heartbreaking as much as it is terrifying. Anna is forced to watch her brother become something monstrous, something she can no longer reach or reason with, and the emotional toll of this moment lingers over the rest of the story. It is revealed that Dracula orchestrated Velkin's infection deliberately, understanding that a werewolf's bite carries a very specific and crucial property, one that ties directly into his larger scheme involving Frankenstein's monster. Only a werewolf's essence, it turns out, can provide the specific reanimating spark needed to give true, lasting life to Dracula's vampire offspring, the missing piece he has been searching for ever since Frankenstein's creature escaped his grasp all those years ago in Paris. This revelation recontextualizes much of what has come before, showing that Dracula's manipulation has been far more calculated and patient than anyone initially realized, using Velkin as an unwitting tool in a plan that has been unfolding for a very long time. Desperate to find a cure or a way to help her infected brother, and increasingly aware that Dracula's true target is not simply the Valerious family but something much larger and more dangerous, Anna and Van Helsing turn their attention toward finding Frankenstein's monster themselves, hoping that the creature might hold answers, or at the very least might be kept out of Dracula's hands before his plan can be completed. Their search leads them deep into the forests and hidden corners of the countryside, following rumors and half-remembered legends about where the monster might have taken refuge in the years since its escape from Paris. Their search eventually brings them into contact with the monster itself, and the encounter proves far different from what either of them expected. Rather than the mindless, violent brute that legend and fear have made him out to be, Frankenstein's monster is revealed to be a gentle, deeply lonely being, aware of his own unnatural existence and desperately wishing only to be left in peace rather than used as a weapon or a curiosity by anyone, whether that be Dracula, the villagers who fear him, or even Van Helsing and Anna themselves. This portrayal humanizes the creature in a way that adds unexpected emotional depth to the film, presenting him not as a monster in the traditional sense, but as a tragic figure caught between forces far more monstrous than he could ever be, someone who never asked to be created and who bears no responsibility for the horror his existence has caused. Van Helsing and Anna attempt to protect the monster, recognizing that if Dracula manages to capture him and complete his plan, the consequences will extend far beyond the borders of Transylvania, potentially unleashing an army of vampire offspring upon the entire world. However, Dracula's forces are relentless, and it is not long before the vampire brides and other minions track down the monster's hiding place, leading to a series of intense confrontations as Van Helsing and his allies fight desperately to keep the creature out of Dracula's grasp. During this stretch of the story, we also gain further insight into Van Helsing's own mysterious past, as fragments of memory begin to surface in response to the events unfolding around him. Certain locations, certain objects, certain moments trigger flashes of recognition that Van Helsing cannot fully explain, hinting that his connection to this conflict runs far deeper than a simple assignment from the Holy Order. These fragments suggest that he has crossed paths with Dracula before, long before his memory was wiped clean, and that there is a personal history between them that neither man fully understands yet, though Dracula, with his centuries of accumulated knowledge and memory, seems to recognize far more about Van Helsing's true identity than Van Helsing himself does. This dynamic adds a layer of dramatic irony to their confrontations, as the audience senses that Dracula is playing a longer, more personal game than Van Helsing initially realizes. As the story hurtles toward its climax, Anna and Van Helsing manage to rescue Velkin temporarily, using Carl's resourcefulness and knowledge of ancient remedies to search for any possible way to reverse or at least control the werewolf curse before the next full moon forces another transformation. Their efforts, however, prove tragically insufficient. During a subsequent confrontation with Dracula's forces, Velkin, once again transformed into his monstrous werewolf form, is killed in the crossfire of the ongoing battle, a devastating loss for Anna, who now finds herself the very last surviving member of her family's cursed bloodline. The weight of this loss transforms her resolve into something even more desperate and singular, as she now carries not only her own fate, but the fate of every Valerious who has come before her, all of them still waiting in limbo for the curse to finally be broken. With Velkin gone, Dracula makes his move to seize Frankenstein's monster and complete his long-delayed plan. In a climactic sequence, the creature is captured and taken to Dracula's castle, where an elaborate laboratory has been constructed deep within its depths, filled with strange machinery designed to harness the reanimating energy needed to bring Dracula's vampire children fully to life. Van Helsing, Anna, and Carl race against time to infiltrate the castle and stop the ritual before it can be completed, understanding that failure will mean unleashing an entirely new generation of vampires upon the world, creatures born rather than turned, potentially far more numerous and far harder to stop than anything the world has faced before. The infiltration of Dracula's castle in these final acts of the story is chaotic and relentless, filled with narrow escapes, brutal confrontations with Dracula's vampire brides, and increasingly desperate improvisation as Van Helsing's carefully planned weapons and strategies begin to run out. Carl, despite his constant fear, proves crucial in these final battles, using his knowledge of the Order's arsenal to create makeshift solutions to problems that would otherwise prove insurmountable. Anna fights with a ferocity born of grief and determination, no longer simply defending her people but avenging her entire family's generations of suffering in one final, decisive confrontation. During the chaos of the castle's fall, Van Helsing finally confronts Dracula directly in a battle that has been building since their very first meeting at the masquerade ball. It is during this confrontation that the truth about Van Helsing's forgotten past is finally revealed, and it turns out to be far more significant than anyone, including Van Helsing himself, could have anticipated. Dracula reveals, with evident satisfaction at finally being able to say it aloud, that Van Helsing was once someone connected directly to Dracula's own distant history, that centuries ago, before his memory was wiped away and he was remade into the Holy Order's hunter, Van Helsing existed as a figure tied to the earliest chapters of Dracula's cursed existence. A connection that explains both the vampire's strange familiarity with him and the fragmented memories that have haunted Van Helsing throughout the entire story. This revelation recontextualizes the entire conflict, transforming what seemed to be a simple mission into something far more personal, a confrontation between two beings whose fates have been intertwined for far longer than either truly understood. During the climactic struggle, Van Helsing is bitten and becomes infected with the werewolf curse himself, transforming in the heat of battle into a creature every bit as monstrous and powerful as the one that killed Velkin. Rather than succumbing entirely to the beast within, however, Van Helsing manages to retain enough control, or enough purpose, to use his transformed state as a weapon against Dracula, understanding in this moment the same truth that Dracula himself exploited earlier in the story, that a werewolf's bite carries a lethal, irreversible power against vampires that no ordinary weapon can match. In a ferocious final confrontation, transformed Van Helsing battles Dracula directly, and though Dracula attempts to reason with him, appealing to whatever connection exists between them, Van Helsing ultimately overcomes him, delivering the fatal bite that Dracula cannot survive. Dracula, mortally wounded, begins to dissolve, his centuries of unnatural life finally coming to an end as his body crumbles away into nothingness, the curse he has inflicted upon so many others finally turned back upon himself. In the chaos of this final moment, Anna rushes toward Van Helsing, still transformed into his werewolf state, and not fully in control of his instincts. Tragically, in the confusion of battle, Van Helsing accidentally attacks and mortally wounds Anna before he can regain control of himself. As he returns to his human form, horrified by what he has done, Anna, dying in his arms, is finally able to deliver the news that both of them have fought and sacrificed everything to achieve. With Dracula destroyed, the ancient curse upon the Valerious family is finally lifted. Anna, along with every member of her family who came before her, is finally free, no longer trapped in limbo, finally able to find the peace that has been denied to her bloodline for centuries. She dies not in despair, but in a strange, hard-won moment of release, her life's singular purpose fulfilled even as it costs her everything. In the aftermath of this devastating climax, Frankenstein's monster, freed from Dracula's laboratory, and no longer needed as a tool in anyone's grand design, chooses his own fate. Rather than continuing to exist as a target for those who fear or wish to exploit him, he opts to end his own unnatural existence, setting fire to the remains of Dracula's collapsing castle and allowing himself to be consumed by the flames, finally finding an escape from a life he never asked for and never truly belonged to. This quiet, somber conclusion to his story mirrors the larger themes running throughout the film, themes of curses, of unnatural life, and of the desperate search for peace that unites nearly every major character, monster and human alike. Van Helsing and Carl, having lost both of their new allies in the final battle, are left to process the devastating cost of their victory. Despite the immense personal toll, their mission has technically succeeded. Dracula is destroyed, his plan to create an army of vampire offspring has been stopped, and the ancient curse upon the Valerious family has finally been broken, allowing Anna and her ancestors to rest in peace after centuries of suffering. The Holy Order, though unaware of the deeply personal cost paid to achieve this victory, will no doubt consider the mission an unqualified success, one more monstrous threat eliminated from the world in their ongoing, secret war against the supernatural. As the story closes, Van Helsing is left with more questions than answers about his own identity, having learned enough about his connection to Dracula's ancient history to know that there is far more to his past than the Holy Order has ever told him, but not enough to fully understand who he truly was before his memory was taken from him. This lingering mystery, combined with the emotional weight of everything he has lost in Transylvania, leaves the character in a place of quiet, unresolved introspection even as the immediate threat has been neutralized. Carl, forever changed by the horrors he has witnessed and the losses he has endured alongside Van Helsing, remains at his side, the two of them presumably destined to continue their work for the Holy Order, hunting down whatever new supernatural threat awaits them next, carrying with them the memory of Anna Valerious and the price that was paid to finally break her family's ancient, tragic curse. The film ultimately presents itself as both a grand, spectacle-driven monster adventure, and, underneath all the action and visual effects, a surprisingly melancholy meditation on curses, sacrifice, and the search for identity. Every major character in the story is defined by something they have lost or something taken from them without their consent, whether it is Anna's entire family and freedom, Velkin's humanity, Frankenstein's monster's peace, or Van Helsing's own memory and sense of self. Dracula, for all his menace and theatrical villainy, is himself revealed to be a being trapped by his own unnatural existence, endlessly searching for a way to create a legacy he can never naturally achieve, and his defeat, while necessary and satisfying from a narrative standpoint, carries with it an undercurrent of tragedy that runs throughout the entire film. By the time the credits roll, Van Helsing has told a story that is as much about the personal cost of endless, secret warfare against darkness as it is about vampires, werewolves, and reanimated monsters clashing in Gothic castles, leaving its central hero forever changed by what he has lost even as he prepares, inevitably, to face whatever monstrous threat comes next. Van Helsing brought together a cast of remarkable performers from Australia, Britain, and the United States, and each of them carried a rich personal history into the roles that made this film such a memorable entry in early 2000s blockbuster cinema. Hugh Jackman, who took on the demanding lead role of Gabriel Van Helsing, was born on October 12, 1968, in Sydney, Australia. He was the youngest of 5 children born to Christopher John Jackman, a Cambridge-trained accountant, and Grace McNeil, a homemaker, both of whom had emigrated from England to Australia the year before his birth as part of a wave of English immigrants seeking new opportunities abroad. Jackman's childhood took a difficult turn when he was only 8 years old, as his parents divorced and his mother moved back to England, leaving him and his siblings to be raised primarily by his father in Sydney. This separation meant that Jackman's relationship with his mother remained distant for much of his early life, though he continued to travel between Australia and England for visits, and it was during those trips that he first developed a genuine love for theatre, often accompanying relatives to plays and gradually falling in love with performance long before he considered it a viable career. As a teenager, Jackman attended Knox Grammar School on Sydney's Upper North Shore, where he became involved in school productions, most notably starring in a staging of My Fair Lady, and eventually rose to become school captain. He was known during these years as an outgoing, athletic student who played rugby and enjoyed the outdoors, though he also carried the nickname Worm due to his lanky build during adolescence. After graduating, Jackman took a gap year working in England before returning to Australia to study at the University of Technology, Sydney, where he pursued a degree in communications with a focus on journalism. It was almost by accident that acting entered his life in a serious way, since a drama elective he needed to complete his coursework ended up igniting a passion that would define the rest of his life. After finishing his degree, Jackman went on to complete additional actor training, eventually enrolling at the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts to sharpen his craft. His early career included Australian television work, most notably a role on the short-lived prison drama series Corelli, which did little for his career on screen but became hugely significant in his personal life, since it was on that set that he met actress Deborah Lee Furness, whom he would go on to marry. Jackman's breakthrough into international stardom came when his friend and fellow Australian actor Russell Crowe turned down the role of Wolverine in the film adaptation of X-Men and personally recommended Jackman to director Bryan Singer instead. Jackman has often joked that he holds some kind of record for the longest audition process in Hollywood history, having first tried out for the part many months before finally landing it. When X-Men was released in the summer of 2000, it became an enormous success, launching Jackman into a new level of global fame almost overnight, and setting him on a path that would eventually lead him to Van Helsing just a few years later. Beyond his action work, Jackman has always maintained a deep connection to musical theater and stage performance, an interest to which he returned again and again throughout his career even as his Hollywood profile grew, reflecting the same versatility that made him equally comfortable playing a monster-hunting action hero and a classically trained singer and dancer on Broadway. Kate Beckinsale, who portrayed the fierce and determined Anna Valerious, was born Catherine Romany Beckinsale on July 26, 1973, in London, England. She was the only child of 2 working actors, her father Richard Beckinsale, a beloved British television performer known for his roles in popular sitcoms, and her mother Judy Lowe, who enjoyed a long and varied career of her own across British television. Tragedy struck Beckinsale's life at an extraordinarily young age when her father died suddenly of a heart attack at only 31 years old, when Beckinsale herself was just 5. This loss left a profound and lasting impact on her, and by her own accounts it shaped much of her emotional outlook in the years that followed. Beckinsale attended the Godolphin and Latimer School, an independent girls' school in London, where she became involved in youth theatre and won awards for her writing in both fiction and poetry, hinting at a creative sensibility that extended well beyond acting alone. She went on to study English at Oxford University, becoming involved with the Oxford University Dramatic Society while still a student, and it was during this period that she made her film debut in a 1993 adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing. Rather than finishing her degree, Beckinsale ultimately chose to leave school early to pursue acting full-time, a decision that quickly paid off as she built a reputation throughout the 1990s for her work in British costume dramas, including television adaptations of works by Jane Austen. Her international breakthrough came in 2001, when she was cast opposite Ben Affleck in the big-budget war film Pearl Harbor, a role that introduced her to American audiences on a massive scale. She followed this with a string of other high-profile projects, but it was her performance as the vampire warrior Selene in the 2003 film Underworld that truly transformed her public image, repositioning her from period drama actress to action star almost overnight. Beckinsale has spoken candidly about how difficult this transition initially was, admitting that she had little experience with the physical demands of action filmmaking, including handling weapons or performing fight choreography, before stepping into that world. Her role in Underworld led directly to her casting in Van Helsing the following year, cementing her status as one of the defining action heroines of that era. Beckinsale's personal life during this period was also undergoing significant change, as she had spent 8 years in a relationship with actor Michael Sheen, with whom she shares a daughter, before beginning a new relationship with Underworld director Len Wiseman, whom she would go on to marry. Later in life, Beckinsale endured further personal loss, including the death of her mother after a long illness, a loss she has described publicly as one of the most devastating experiences of her life, echoing the early loss of her father decades earlier. Richard Roxburgh, who brought Count Dracula to life with such theatrical menace, was born on January 23, 1962, in Albury, New South Wales, Australia, the youngest of 6 children born to John Roxburgh, a successful accountant, and his wife Mary. As a teenager, Roxburgh already displayed a passion for performance, taking on the demanding role of Willie Loman in a school production of Death of a Salesman while still in high school. Rather than pursuing acting immediately, Roxburgh first studied economics at the Australian National University in Canberra, earning a formal degree before ultimately deciding that his true calling lay in performance rather than finance. He auditioned for the National Institute of Dramatic Art, one of Australia's most prestigious acting schools, and was accepted on his second attempt, going on to build a career first in Australian theatre with the Sydney Theatre Company immediately after graduating. Roxburgh's early stage work included a critically acclaimed production of Hamlet performed alongside fellow Australian actors Geoffrey Rush and David Wenham, the very same David Wenham who would later join him in Van Helsing playing the loyal Friar Carl. Roxburgh's breakthrough into wider public recognition in Australia came through his portrayal of a real-life police detective in a 1995 television miniseries, a role that showcased his ability to bring complexity and menace to morally ambiguous characters. His international film career began to take shape around the turn of the millennium, starting with a supporting role as a villain's henchman in Mission Impossible 2, followed shortly after by a memorable turn in Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge, both of which were filmed in Australia and helped establish him as a performer capable of bringing theatrical flair to major Hollywood productions. This growing reputation for playing charismatic villains led directly to his casting as Dracula in Van Helsing. Interestingly, Roxburgh's personal life became intertwined with the Van Helsing production itself, as he met actress Sylvia Kololka, who played one of Dracula's vampire brides in the film, on set, and the two would go on to marry in 2004, the same year the movie was released. Roxburgh continued to build an extensive career across Australian and international film, television, and theatre in the years following Van Helsing, eventually becoming known for a long-running television role as a troubled defense lawyer, while also stepping behind the camera as a filmmaker and even publishing a children's book, demonstrating a creative range that extended well beyond acting alone. David Wenham, who played the endearing and resourceful Friar Carl, was born in Marrickville, a suburb of Sydney, Australia, into a large family that included 5 older sisters and 1 older brother. He was raised in the Roman Catholic faith and attended Christian Brothers High School in Lewisham, Sydney, before going on to study performing arts at what is now known as Western Sydney University, graduating with a Bachelor of Arts in 1987. Wenham began building his acting career on Australian stages and television screens throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, gradually earning a reputation as one of the country's most versatile character actors. He became particularly well known in Australia for his roles in television dramas and comedies, including a beloved role as an easygoing surfing instructor on a popular Australian series, a performance that made him something of a household name domestically even before international audiences took notice. Wenham's collaboration with Richard Roxburgh in the acclaimed 1994 theatrical production of Hamlet further established his reputation within Australia's tight-knit and highly respected theatre community. His international breakout came through a supporting role in the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, where his performance as a noble but tragic character introduced him to a massive global audience for the first time. This newfound international visibility helped position him for roles like Carl in Van Helsing, where his comedic timing and warmth provided an essential counterbalance to the film's darker, more intense elements. Wenham continued to work extensively across both Australian and international productions in the years following Van Helsing, maintaining a career that moved fluidly between blockbuster franchises and smaller, more personal Australian films and television projects, a versatility that has remained a defining hallmark of his career. Will Kemp, who portrayed the tragic Vulcan Valerious, Anna's brother who becomes infected with the werewolf curse, was born on June 29, 1977, in Hertfordshire, England, to parents Barry and Rosalind Kemp. Unlike most of his co-stars, Kemp did not come from a traditional acting background at all. Instead, his early life was devoted almost entirely to classical dance. He trained rigorously at the prestigious Royal Ballet School, and at the age of 17 he was accepted into Adventures in Motion Pictures, a highly regarded contemporary dance company. Kemp went on to achieve considerable acclaim as a professional dancer, most notably winning the leading role of the Swan in Matthew Bourne's groundbreaking all-male reimagining of Swan Lake, a production he performed in both London and on Broadway between 1997 and 2000. This role brought him significant recognition within the dance world and led to modeling opportunities as well, including appearances in high-profile advertising campaigns, though Kemp made the deliberate choice to turn down a lucrative modeling contract with a major fashion house, explaining that he did not want to be seen primarily as a model rather than a serious performer. Van Helsing marked Kemp's very first film role, an extraordinary leap from the world of professional ballet directly into a major Hollywood blockbuster, and his physicality and grace as a trained dancer proved to be a significant asset in bringing the physically demanding werewolf transformation sequences to life. Following Van Helsing, Kemp continued to build a career in film and television, appearing in a range of projects across multiple genres in the years that followed, eventually becoming a familiar face in romantic television movies as well as dramatic series, while never fully abandoning the movement-based artistry that first defined his career as a dancer. Kevin J. O'Connor, who brought a memorably unsettling energy to the role of Igor, Dracula's loyal and eccentric servant, was born on November 15, 1963, in Chicago, Illinois. Long before pursuing acting, O'Connor's earliest ambition was actually to become a cartoonist, and it was only later that his interests shifted decisively toward performance. He received his early acting training in Chicago and went on to study at DePaul University, immersing himself in the city's respected theater scene, including work with the renowned Steppenwolf Theater Company, one of the most influential ensemble theaters in the United States. O'Connor made his film debut in the mid-1980s with a role in Peggy Sue Got Married, a film that also happened to feature Hugh Jackman's future Van Helsing co-star in an entirely different capacity years apart, though the two would not cross paths professionally until Van Helsing itself. Over the following years, O'Connor built a career as a dependable and distinctive character actor, taking on a wide variety of roles across film and television. He became particularly associated with director Stephen Sommers, appearing in several of his projects throughout the 1990s and 2000s, a collaborative relationship that made O'Connor something of a good luck charm for Sommers's productions and directly led to his casting as Igor in Van Helsing. O'Connor has never identified as a strict method actor, instead relying on his own developed techniques to maintain focus and authenticity in his performances, an approach that allowed him to bring a strange, memorable blend of comic unease and genuine menace to his portrayal of Dracula's devoted servant. Schuyler Hensley, who took on the physically and emotionally demanding role of Frankenstein's monster, was born Schuyler Paul Hensley on March 6, 1967, in Atlanta, Georgia. Unlike most of his Van Helsing castmates, Hensley's background was rooted primarily in classical music and musical theater rather than film. He pursued formal musical training at the University of Georgia before continuing his education at the Manhattan School of Music and later the prestigious Curtis Institute of Music, building a strong foundation as a trained singer alongside his acting skills. Hensley's breakthrough came through musical theater, specifically through his powerful performance as the menacing character Judd Fry in a celebrated revival of the musical Oklahoma, a production that first ran in London before transferring to Broadway. His performance in this role earned him a Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical, along with additional nominations from other major theater awards, establishing him as one of the most respected performers in contemporary musical theater. Notably, Hensley's path crossed with his future Van Helsing co-star Hugh Jackman on more than one occasion throughout his career, as the two performed together in stage productions of Oklahoma, a shared history that existed well before either of them stepped onto the set of Van Helsing. Hensley's imposing physical presence combined with his ability to convey deep emotional vulnerability made him a natural fit for the role of Frankenstein's monster, a character that required an actor capable of eliciting sympathy from beneath heavy makeup and prosthetics rather than relying on dialogue or facial expression alone. Following Van Helsing, Hensley continued to divide his career between film roles and an ongoing, deeply respected presence on Broadway and in international musical theater, remaining one of the most accomplished singer-actors of his generation. Together, this ensemble of performers, drawn from the worlds of Australian film and television, British costume drama and action cinema, classical ballet, Chicago theater, and Broadway musicals, brought a remarkable depth of experience and craft to Van Helsing, each of them carrying years of personal history and hard-won artistic training into a film that asked them to bring some of literature's most enduring monsters vividly back to life. That covers the complete life histories of the main cast behind Van Helsing, from their early beginnings all the way through to the roles that brought them together in this film. If you enjoyed learning more about the people behind these iconic characters, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow movie lovers, and subscribe to Review and Facts for more detailed breakdowns just like this one. When Universal Pictures greenlit Van Helsing, they were not simply funding another monster movie. They were bankrolling one of the most ambitious and expensive productions of the early 2000s, a film that carried a reported production budget somewhere between $160 and $170 million, figures that placed it firmly among the most costly films ever made up to that point in cinema history. To put that number into perspective, this was a budget that rivaled or exceeded some of the biggest superhero and fantasy blockbusters of its era, an enormous financial gamble placed on director Stephen Sommers, who had already proven with the Mummy franchise that he could deliver spectacle-driven, effects-heavy entertainment capable of pulling in massive worldwide audiences. Universal was betting that Sommers could work the same magic with an entirely different set of classic monsters, and they opened their checkbook accordingly, giving him the resources to build a world unlike anything audiences had seen in a Dracula adaptation before. A significant portion of that enormous budget went directly into visual effects, and it is easy to understand why once you consider the sheer scale of what the film was attempting to achieve. Van Helsing required convincing, dynamic transformations for its werewolves, elaborate computer-generated recreations of Dracula's vampire brides shifting between their human and monstrous winged forms, and countless digital enhancements needed to bring Frankenstein's monster, the fog-drenched countryside of Transylvania, and the sprawling Gothic architecture of Dracula's castle vividly to life. This was still an era when digital effects technology, while advancing rapidly, remained enormously labor-intensive and expensive, requiring armies of visual effects artists working for months on individual sequences, particularly the elaborate werewolf transformation scenes that needed to feel both horrifying and physically believable rather than cartoonish. Industry reporting at the time noted that these effects-heavy werewolf and vampire transformation sequences were among the single most expensive elements of the entire production, consuming a disproportionate share of the overall budget relative to their screen time, simply because of how technically demanding they were to execute convincingly. Beyond the visual effects, an enormous amount of money was funneled into physical production design and set construction. Rather than relying entirely on digital backdrops, Summers and his production team insisted on building massive, tangible sets, particularly for the interior of Dracula's castle, giving actors real physical spaces to move through and interact with rather than performing against blank green screens for the entirety of the film. These elaborate sets were constructed both on sound stages in Los Angeles and on location in the Czech Republic, and the level of detail poured into them, from towering Gothic stonework to ornate laboratory equipment for the Frankenstein sequences, represented a substantial chunk of the budget on its own. The production design team worked to recreate the visual language of classic Universal monster films from the 1930s and 40s while scaling everything up to a size and grandeur appropriate for a modern blockbuster, and that combination of nostalgic homage and technical ambition did not come cheap. Costume design also proved to be a costly and labor-intensive part of the production, particularly given the film's enormous cast of background performers required for the elaborate masquerade ball sequence at Dracula's castle. That single sequence alone required hundreds of ornate period-appropriate costumes, each one designed to look simultaneously elegant and unsettling, since the guests at Dracula's ball needed to appear as though they might be entirely human or entirely monstrous depending on the moment. The principal cast's costuming presented its own unique challenges as well. Kate Beckinsale's costume as Anna Valerious involved a heavily structured corset that she would later describe with real exasperation, admitting in interviews that she grew to despise the garment so intensely by the end of filming that she wanted nothing more than to see it destroyed once production wrapped. Hugh Jackman's iconic Van Helsing look, with its long coat and wide-brimmed hat, also went through extensive design work to strike the right balance between old-fashioned monster hunter and modern action hero, a costume that needed to look both period-appropriate and functional enough to withstand months of physically demanding stunt work. Filming locations added yet another significant layer of expense to the production. Rather than shooting entirely on a Hollywood backlit, Van Helsing's production made extensive use of real locations throughout Prague and the surrounding Czech countryside, taking advantage of the city's genuinely Gothic architecture to stand in for multiple different settings throughout the film, including Paris, Budapest, and the fictional heart of Transylvania itself. Iconic Prague landmarks including the Charles Bridge, the historic Old Town Square, and several centuries-old churches and palaces were used as filming locations, lending the movie an authentic sense of old-world atmosphere that would have been extraordinarily difficult and expensive to fully recreate through artificial sets alone. The production also filmed at Barrandov Studios, one of the largest and most historic film production facilities in Europe, and ventured out to additional locations including a genuine centuries-old castle in the Czech countryside, all of which required significant logistical coordination, international crew coordination, and location fees layered on top of the film's already substantial budget. Despite the eye-watering cost of production, Van Helsing ultimately performed reasonably well at the global box office, earning slightly over $300 million worldwide against its reported budget of somewhere between $160 and $170 million. However, when accounting for the widely understood industry rule of thumb that a film typically needs to earn roughly double its production budget once marketing, advertising, and distribution costs are factored in, Van Helsing's box office performance left it in a far more precarious financial position than the raw numbers might initially suggest. The film was generally viewed within the industry as a financial disappointment relative to its enormous budget, even though it was technically profitable in terms of pure ticket sales. And this financial reality played a significant role in Universal's eventual decision to abandon Stephen Sommers' original plans for expanding Van Helsing into a larger franchise with sequels and spin-offs exploring more of Universal's classic monster catalog. Now, shifting away from the financial side of the production and toward the more entertaining stories that emerged from the set itself, Van Helsing turned out to be a production filled with memorable, occasionally chaotic, and often genuinely funny moments, the kind of stories that cast and crew members have continued sharing in interviews and commentary tracks in the years since the film's release. One of the most widely repeated stories from the production involves an incident during one of the film's elaborate action sequences, where Hugh Jackman, in the midst of performing physically demanding fight choreography, accidentally struck and broke the hand of an extra who was standing nearby on set. Given the sheer scale and intensity of the film's action sequences, which required Jackman to swing weapons, throw punches, and engage in complicated physical stunts often surrounded by dozens of background performers, this kind of accident, while certainly unfortunate for the extra involved, was almost an inevitable byproduct of staging fight scenes at this scale with practical, in-camera choreography rather than relying entirely on digital doubles. Cast and crew members have referenced the story over the years as an example of just how physically demanding and occasionally unpredictable the production's action-heavy shooting days could become, particularly during sequences filmed on the elaborate Court of Miracles set, a location that had actually been used decades earlier for other classic Universal horror productions including the original Frankenstein and Dracula films, giving this particular corner of the production a strange, almost poetic connection to the very monster movies Van Helsing was paying homage to. Hugh Jackman's physical commitment to the role extended well beyond this single incident, and by numerous accounts, the actor pushed himself hard throughout the shoot in order to perform as much of his own stunt work as possible. During the demanding production schedule, Jackman reportedly suffered an arm injury at one point during filming, a testament to just how physically punishing the shoot became given the sheer volume of stunts, wire work, and hand-to-hand combat sequences required of the lead role. Despite the injury, production continued, with the team adjusting shooting schedules and stunt choreography as needed to accommodate Jackman's recovery while keeping the demanding production on track, a common but rarely glamorous reality of blockbuster filmmaking that requires enormous physical sacrifice from its leading performers. Another amusing wrinkle in the production involved Jackman's hair, or rather, the lack of it, at the start of filming. Jackman had recently worn his hair notably short for a previous role, and when production on Van Helsing began, his natural hair had not yet grown out enough to match the flowing, rugged look the filmmakers envisioned for Gabriel Van Helsing. As a result, Jackman spent the early portion of the shoot wearing hair extensions to achieve the character's signature appearance, only gradually transitioning away from the extensions as his own hair grew out naturally over the course of the lengthy production schedule. This meant that eagle-eyed viewers watching the film closely can actually spot subtle differences in Jackman's hairstyle depending on which point in the shooting schedule a particular scene was filmed, a small but telling detail about just how long and drawn-out the production process for a film of this scale truly was. The film's masquerade ball sequence, one of the most visually elaborate set pieces in the entire movie, generated its own share of behind-the-scenes stories. To populate this lavish Gothic gathering with an appropriately eerie and skillful ensemble of dancers and performers, the production made the decision to cast local circus performers from Prague rather than relying solely on traditional background actors, bringing in individuals with genuine acrobatic and performance skills to lend the sequence an unsettling, otherworldly quality that traditional extras might not have been able to achieve. A professional soprano was also brought in specifically to perform the haunting vocal piece that opens the sequence, adding a layer of authentic musical performance to a scene that needed to feel both beautiful and quietly menacing at the same time. These choices reflected the lengths the production was willing to go to in order to make even background elements of the film feel textured and genuine rather than simply generic. Not every element planned for the masquerade ball sequence made it into the final cut of the film, and one particular story involving actress Elena Anaya, who played the vampire bride Alara, has become a favorite among fans who have dug into the film's production history. Anaya's character was originally intended to have a significant presence during the ball sequence, complete with an elaborate and complicated dance routine that Anaya spent considerable time rehearsing in preparation for filming. However, when the film went through its editing process, these scenes were ultimately cut entirely, meaning that all of Anaya's carefully rehearsed choreography never made it in front of audiences. Adding a strange final note to this particular story, a surviving photograph from the production shows Anaya's character in an elaborate sparkling red gown in a moment involving Anna Valerious that never appeared in the finished film, a small glimpse into a version of the masquerade sequence that was ultimately left on the cutting room floor. The commentary tracks recorded for the film's home video release also offer a wealth of insight into the lighter, more entertaining side of the production, since Stephen Sommers and producer Bob Duxey recorded a crew-focused commentary track discussing the technical and logistical challenges of bringing the film to life, while a separate cast commentary track featuring Richard Roxburgh, Schuler Hensley, and Will Kemp gave fans a chance to hear the actors themselves reflect on their experiences, making the film, often with a noticeably more relaxed and humorous tone than the more technically focused crew commentary. Anyone who has listened to these tracks over the years has come away with a strong sense that despite the grueling and physically demanding nature of the shoot, the cast genuinely enjoyed each other's company and found plenty of opportunities for humor even during the film's most intense and technically complicated sequences. The international, multicultural nature of the cast also became something of a running, good-natured joke both during and after production. Van Helsing assembled a genuinely global ensemble, with Australian actors Hugh Jackman and Richard Roxburgh, Australian actor David Wenham, British performers Kate Beckinsale and Will Kemp, Spanish actress Elena Anaya, and American actor Kevin J. O'Connor, all playing characters meant to be residents of Eastern Europe, each of them adopting accents that were, by design, never meant to be strictly accurate to any single real-world region. Jackman and Wenham in particular leaned into British-sounding accents for their characters despite being Australian themselves, while the rest of the international casts brought their own varied approaches to sounding appropriately Transylvanian, resulting in a wonderfully inconsistent, almost theatrical blend of accents throughout the film that fans and critics alike have jokingly picked apart in the years since its release. Far from being a source of tension on set, this patchwork of accents appears to have simply been treated as part of the fun, theatrical spirit of the production, with everyone involved seemingly aware that strict linguistic accuracy was never really the point of a film this openly embracing its own larger-than-life, gothic fantasy sensibilities. Richard Roxburgh's time on set produced one of the most charming behind-the-scenes stories connected to the entire production, though this one falls more into the category of heartwarming rather than outright funny. During filming, Roxburgh, who played Count Dracula, met actress Sylvia Koloka, who portrayed one of Dracula's vampire brides, and the two began a relationship that blossomed over the course of the shoot. By the time the film was released in theaters in May of 2004, Roxburgh and Koloka had already gotten married, meaning that the elaborate, monster-filled production had quietly given rise to a genuine real-life love story behind the scenes, a detail that has often surprised fans who assume that a film this dark and gothic in tone would have had a correspondingly serious atmosphere on set, when in reality it seems to have fostered plenty of warmth and connection among its cast. The physical demands placed on the cast extended well beyond simple stunt work and into the realm of pure endurance, particularly for actors required to wear heavy prosthetics and makeup for extended periods. Schuler Hensley, who portrayed Frankenstein's monster, spent hours in makeup chairs being transformed into the towering, scarred creature audiences see on screen, a process that by all accounts required enormous patience and physical tolerance given the sheer amount of prosthetic material applied to his face and body each shooting day. Despite the discomfort involved, Hensley's background as a trained stage performer accustomed to physically demanding roles seems to have prepared him well for the challenge, and his ability to convey genuine emotion and vulnerability from beneath such extensive prosthetic work became one of the more quietly impressive achievements of the entire production. Even if achieving that performance required grueling hours of preparation before cameras ever started rolling each day. Kate Beckinsale's experience filming the action-heavy sequences also produced its own share of memorable, if occasionally exasperating, moments. Having transitioned into action filmmaking only a year earlier with Underworld, Beckinsale has spoken candidly in interviews about how unprepared she initially felt for the physical demands of this type of filmmaking. Admitting that skills like handling weapons convincingly or performing choreographed fight sequences did not come naturally to her at first and required extensive training and practice to pull off convincingly on camera. Combined with her well-documented frustration with the restrictive corset costume she wore throughout the production, Beckinsale's time on Van Helsing represented a genuine trial by fire in terms of physical performance, and by her own account, she emerged from the experience with a newfound respect for the sheer physical toll that action filmmaking takes on performers. A lesson that would go on to serve her well throughout her subsequent, action-heavy career in the years following Van Helsing's release. The production's ambitious use of practical sets alongside extensive visual effects work created its own unique set of behind-the-scenes challenges and occasional moments of levity, as actors were frequently required to perform opposite entirely digital characters or effects that would only be added into the film during post-production. Scenes involving the vampire brides transforming into their monstrous, winged forms required actors to imagine and react to creatures that were not physically present on set, relying entirely on direction from Stephen Sommers and their own imagination to sell the horror and intensity of these encounters. Cast members have noted in various interviews over the years that performing convincing fear or shock reactions to nothing more than a tennis ball on a stick, or an off-camera crew member miming the movement of a creature that would only exist once visual effects artists finished their work months later, required a particular kind of focus, and frequently produced plenty of unintentional comedy on set as actors tried to maintain serious, dramatic performances while reacting to essentially nothing at all. Stephen Sommers' directing style throughout the production has been described by various cast and crew members as high energy and enthusiastic, with Sommers himself being a lifelong, genuine fan of the classic Universal monster movies that inspired Van Helsing in the first place. This personal passion for the material reportedly translated into an atmosphere on set that, despite the enormous technical and financial pressures of the production, remained infused with a sense of genuine excitement and reverence for the monster movie tradition being honored. Sommers has spoken in interviews about wanting to create a film that captured the fun, theatrical spirit of those classic 1930s and 40s monster movies while updating them with modern technology and action sensibilities, and by most accounts, this enthusiasm was infectious among the cast and crew, even during the most grueling and technically demanding stretches of the shooting schedule. The sheer scale of the production also meant that the crew had to manage logistics across multiple countries and continents, coordinating between location shooting in the Czech Republic and extensive soundstage work back in Los Angeles, a challenge that required careful planning to ensure that actors, sets, costumes, and effects elements could be seamlessly integrated despite being filmed thousands of miles apart at different points in the production schedule. This international production approach, while logistically complicated and undoubtedly expensive, allowed the filmmakers to combine the authentic old-world atmosphere of genuine European locations with the controlled, technically precise environment of a major Hollywood soundstage, a combination that ultimately helped give Van Helsing its distinctive visual identity, blending real Gothic architecture with elaborate, fantastical set pieces that could only have been built from scratch. Looking back on the production as a whole, Van Helsing stands as a fascinating case study in early 2000s blockbuster filmmaking, a film that combined an enormous financial investment, ambitious technical achievements in visual effects and practical set design, and a genuinely dedicated international cast willing to push themselves physically and creatively in service of bringing Stephen Sommers' monster-filled vision to life. The stories that have emerged from the production over the years, from Jackman's stunt-related mishaps and hair extension struggles, to Beckinsale's ongoing battle with her costume, to Roxburgh finding love with his vampire bride co-star, paint a picture of a production that, despite its massive scale and considerable financial pressure, remained grounded in genuine camaraderie and shared enthusiasm for the material among everyone involved. Even years after its release, cast members have continued to speak fondly of their time working on the film, suggesting that regardless of how the movie ultimately performed financially or critically, the experience of making it left a lasting, largely positive impression on the people who brought it to life. To truly understand what Van Helsing was attempting to accomplish as a piece of filmmaking, it helps to step far back from the movie itself and look at the centuries of folklore, literature, and cinematic history that it was drawing from, blending, and ultimately paying tribute to. This was not simply an action film built around a charismatic hero fighting a single memorable villain. It was a film consciously constructed as a celebration of an entire tradition of monster storytelling, one that stretches back through Eastern European folklore, 19th-century Gothic literature, and the golden age of American horror cinema, all filtered through the sensibilities of a modern, effects-driven blockbuster. At the very heart of the film sits Count Dracula, and to understand the cultural weight this character carries, it is worth exploring where the literary Dracula actually came from. Bram Stoker, an Irish author working in London, published his now legendary novel Dracula in 1897, and in doing so, he created what would become arguably the single most recognizable monster in the history of Western literature and cinema. Stoker never actually traveled to Transylvania or the surrounding regions of Eastern Europe himself. Instead, his vision of this dark, superstition-steeped landscape was built almost entirely out of research conducted in libraries back in London, where he immersed himself in whatever accounts, travel writings, and historical records he could find describing the region. During this research process, Stoker came across the name Dracula in a book written by a British diplomat discussing the history of Wallachia, a historical region that forms part of modern-day Romania. Stoker was struck by the word itself, noting in his own research notes that in the Wallachian language, Dracula essentially translated to something akin to devil, and that it had historically been used as a kind of honorific surname applied to individuals who distinguished themselves through courage, cruelty, or cunning. This connection between the name and its dark, devilish connotations proved irresistible to Stoker, and he ultimately borrowed it for his fictional vampire, even though his early drafts of the novel actually referred to the character by an entirely different name before Dracula was settled upon. The question of whether Stoker's Dracula was directly based on a real historical figure has been debated by scholars for decades, but the most widely cited connection points to Vlad III of Wallachia, a 15th-century military leader and prince more commonly remembered today by his fearsome nickname, Vlad the Impaler. Born around 1431 in the town of Sighisoara, located in the heart of Transylvania, Vlad III came from a noble family whose name, Dracal, derived from the Latin word for dragon, itself a reference to his father's induction into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order established to defend Christian Europe against the encroaching Ottoman Empire. This connection to the word dragon eventually gave rise to Vlad's own nickname, Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, a title that would echo down through history and eventually find its way, centuries later, into Stoker's fictional creation. Vlad the Impaler earned his infamous reputation through his brutal treatment of enemies and political rivals, with some historical estimates suggesting he was responsible for tens of thousands of deaths throughout his reign, a significant portion of them carried out through the gruesome method of impalement that gave him his enduring nickname. It is worth noting that historians remain divided on exactly how directly Stoker intended to connect his fictional vampire to this specific historical figure, with many scholars arguing that Stoker was drawn primarily to the evocative power of the name itself and the broader atmosphere of Transylvanian folklore surrounding vampiric undead creatures, known in various regional traditions as Nosferatu, rather than crafting a deliberate, detailed portrait of Vlad the Impaler specifically. Regardless of the precise nature of that connection, the association between the historical warlord and the fictional count has become deeply embedded in popular culture over the many decades since Stoker's novel was first published, cemented further by later films and adaptations that explicitly drew connections between the two figures. Van Helsing itself, through its title character, draws directly from this same literary well, though with a significant reworking of the source material. In Stoker's original 1897 novel, the character of Abraham Van Helsing is portrayed as an elderly Dutch professor, a learned scholar of medicine and the occult who serves as a mentor figure and guide to the younger protagonists hunting Dracula throughout the story, relying on his vast intellectual knowledge rather than physical prowess to combat the vampire threat. The 2004 film makes a dramatic and deliberate departure from this portrayal, transforming Van Helsing into Gabriel Van Helsing, a considerably younger, more physically imposing action hero working as a secretive agent for the Vatican rather than an independent academic. This reinvention reflects the broader trend in early 2000s blockbuster filmmaking, where studios frequently sought to reimagine classic literary and cinematic figures as more conventionally heroic, physically dynamic leads capable of carrying large-scale action sequences. A trend that mirrored similar reinventions happening across the industry during this same era as Hollywood worked to modernize older properties for contemporary audiences raised on faster-paced, effects-heavy entertainment. Beyond Dracula and Van Helsing themselves, the film's decision to weave in Frankenstein's monster and the Wolf-Man mythology alongside the vampire narrative reflects a much broader cultural phenomenon that had been building within Universal Pictures for decades before Van Helsing was ever conceived. During the 1930s and 40s, Universal Pictures built its entire horror film legacy around a specific roster of monster characters, including Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolf-Man, each originating from different literary and folkloric traditions but united under Universal's distinctive cinematic house style. These monsters became so culturally significant during this golden age of Universal horror that the studio eventually began crossing them over into shared films together, pitting Frankenstein's monster against the Wolf-Man in later entries and gradually building toward the idea of a unified monster universe decades before that concept became a dominant strategy across the modern film industry. Van Helsing represented a direct, conscious attempt to revive and honor this specific legacy, essentially functioning as Universal's tribute to its own foundational horror catalog. Updated with contemporary visual effects technology, and repackaged as a summer action blockbuster designed to introduce these classic characters to an entirely new generation of moviegoers who may have had little to no familiarity with the black and white originals that started it all. The Frankenstein mythology woven into Van Helsing's narrative traces its own literary roots back even further than Dracula, originating with Mary Shelley's foundational novel, first published in the early 19th century, which told the story of a scientist whose obsessive quest to conquer death through unnatural means results in the creation of a tragic, misunderstood creature ultimately rejected by society and by his own creator. This story has endured for over 2 centuries as one of the most influential and frequently reinterpreted works in the history of speculative fiction, and its central themes involving the ethical boundaries of scientific ambition, the nature of what defines monstrosity, and the tragic consequences of playing God have remained culturally resonant across countless adaptations and reinterpretations over the decades. Van Helsing's version of the creature leans heavily into this tradition of sympathetic portrayal, presenting Frankenstein's monster not as a mindless engine of destruction, but as a lonely, tragic figure caught in the middle of a larger conflict entirely beyond his control or understanding. A characterization choice that directly echoes the emotional core of Shelley's original novel, even as the film surrounds this character with considerably more spectacle and action than Shelley's more contemplative source material ever contained. The werewolf mythology incorporated into the film through the characters of Velkin and eventually Van Helsing himself draws from an entirely separate but equally ancient folkloric tradition, one with roots stretching back through centuries of European legend describing humans transforming into wolves under specific conditions, most commonly tied to the cycle of the full moon. While werewolf legends existed in various forms across many different cultures long before cinema existed, the specific cinematic conventions audiences associate with werewolves today, including painful physical transformation sequences, vulnerability to silver, and the connection to lunar cycles, were substantially shaped by Universal's own 1940s film centered on this mythology, which helped codify many of the werewolf tropes that have persisted in popular culture ever since. Van Helsing's decision to incorporate this werewolf mythology alongside its vampire and Frankenstein storylines allowed the film to complete its tribute to the full trio of Universal's most iconic classic monsters within a single, unified narrative, weaving together three distinct folkloric and literary traditions into one continuous story in a way that few previous adaptations had attempted on this scale. Beyond its monster mythology, Van Helsing's setting itself carries significant cultural weight. Transylvania, the historical region at the heart of the film's story, occupies a unique and somewhat fraught place in the popular Western imagination, largely as a direct result of Stoker's novel and the countless adaptations that followed it. In reality, Transylvania is a genuine historical region located in modern-day Romania, possessing its own rich, complex cultural history entirely separate from the Gothic horror mythology that Western popular culture has layered onto it over the past century and a quarter. The region's association with vampires and supernatural darkness, while now deeply entrenched in global popular culture, represents a somewhat one-dimensional Western literary invention rather than an accurate reflection of the area's actual folklore, history, or identity. And this dynamic reflects a broader pattern common throughout the history of Gothic literature, in which unfamiliar, distant regions were often exoticized and mythologized by Western authors seeking to create atmospheres of mystery and danger for their audiences back home. Van Helsing, as a direct descendant of this literary tradition, continues to draw upon and reinforce this particular vision of Transylvania as a fog-shrouded land of ancient curses and lurking supernatural evil, a portrayal that, while certainly effective for the purposes of Gothic horror storytelling, exists as much within the realm of literary myth as it does within any accurate reflection of the region's genuine history or culture. The character of Igor, Dracula's hunched, loyal servant portrayed in the film, similarly carries an interesting cultural history worth exploring. Interestingly, the name Igor and the specific archetype of a mad scientist hunchbacked assistant do not actually originate from Mary Shelley's original Frankenstein novel at all, where no such character exists. Instead, this particular character type was essentially invented by later stage and film adaptations of the Frankenstein story throughout the early 20th century, eventually becoming such a firmly established piece of popular culture shorthand that audiences today often assume the character was present in the original literary source material when in fact he represents an entirely separate cinematic invention that has, over time, become inseparably linked to the broader Frankenstein mythology in the public imagination. Van Helsing's inclusion of Igor as a servant to Dracula rather than strictly to Frankenstein represents another creative liberty taken by the filmmakers, blending together different strands of monster movie tradition into their own unique narrative synthesis rather than adhering strictly to any single source text. The film's visual and narrative structure also reflects a broader cultural moment in early 2000s Hollywood, a period during which numerous major studios were actively mining their own historical catalogs and classic properties in search of franchise potential, hoping to replicate the massive success that comic book adaptations and fantasy epics were beginning to achieve during this same era. Van Helsing arrived in theaters during a period when audiences were increasingly receptive to large-scale, effects-driven adaptations of classic or previously established properties, following closely on the heels of successful franchises built around comic book characters, fantasy literature, and other established intellectual property. Universal's decision to invest such an enormous budget into reviving its own classic monster characters reflected a calculated bet that this same appetite for spectacle-driven, franchise-oriented filmmaking could be applied just as effectively to properties rooted in 19th and early 20th century Gothic literature and classic horror cinema, rather than exclusively to more contemporary comic book source material. From a broader historical perspective within the horror genre itself, Van Helsing also represents an interesting case study in how monster movie storytelling evolved throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. The earliest Universal monster films of the 1930s relied heavily on atmosphere, shadow, and implication to generate their scares, working within the technological limitations of early sound-era filmmaking while drawing audiences in through slow-building dread and Gothic set design. By the time Van Helsing arrived in 2004, horror and monster storytelling had been thoroughly reshaped by decades of technological advancement, shifting audience expectations, and the genre-blending sensibilities that had come to dominate blockbuster filmmaking more broadly. Rather than positioning itself as a pure horror film in the tradition of its black and white predecessors, Van Helsing functioned much more explicitly as an action-adventure film that happened to feature horror iconography, prioritizing large-scale spectacle, elaborate stunt choreography, and rapid pacing over the slower, more atmospheric approach to dread and suspense that characterized the earlier Universal monster classics. This shift reflects a broader trend across the horror-adjacent genre landscape during this period, as numerous properties originally rooted in more traditional horror sensibilities were increasingly reimagined as action-oriented blockbusters aimed at capturing the widest possible mainstream audience. A trend that would continue to shape how classic horror properties were approached by major studios for years following Van Helsing's release. The film's Masquerade Ball sequence, one of its most visually elaborate set pieces, also carries interesting cultural resonance worth examining. Masquerade balls and their association with hidden identities, deception, and lurking danger beneath a veneer of aristocratic elegance have long served as a popular narrative device throughout Gothic literature and film, allowing storytellers to explore themes of concealed monstrousness existing just beneath a polished, civilized surface. This particular narrative device connects Van Helsing to a long lineage of Gothic storytelling stretching back through countless vampire narratives and aristocratic horror tales, in which the veneer of refined, high society elegance often serves as a thin disguise concealing genuinely monstrous or predatory behavior underneath. A recurring thematic tension that has remained a staple of vampire fiction specifically since well before Stoker's original novel and has continued to appear across countless subsequent adaptations and reinterpretations of vampire mythology in the decades since. It is also worth considering Van Helsing within the specific historical context of Universal Pictures as a studio institution. By the time this film went into production, Universal had spent decades since its original 1930s and 40s monster movie era largely stepping away from these particular characters as the centerpiece of its filmmaking identity, instead pursuing other genres and franchises throughout the intervening decades. Van Helsing represented a deliberate, conscious return to this specific piece of studio history, an attempt by Universal to reclaim and modernize characters and mythology that had, in many ways, defined the studio's earliest cinematic identity nearly 70 years earlier. This makes the film significant not only as a standalone piece of entertainment but as an artifact of studio history, representing one chapter in Universal's long, ongoing relationship with its own classic monster catalog. A relationship that would continue to evolve in the years following Van Helsing's release as the studio periodically revisited and reimagined these same characters through various other projects and creative approaches in the decades that followed. The film's thematic preoccupation with curses, and specifically with the idea of an entire bloodline suffering under the weight of an ancestral sin committed generations earlier, also connects Van Helsing to much older storytelling traditions extending well beyond the specific literary sources it draws from directly. The concept of generational curses, in which the sins or mistakes of ancestors continue to haunt and torment their descendants across multiple generations until some form of resolution or redemption is achieved, appears throughout countless mythological and folkloric traditions spanning numerous cultures throughout human history, reflecting deep-seated cultural anxieties about inherited guilt, unresolved historical wrongs, and the burden that the past continues to place upon the present. Van Helsing's central storyline involving the Valerious family's centuries-long struggle to break free from Dracula's ancient curse taps directly into this much older, more universal storytelling tradition, giving the film's central conflict a thematic resonance that extends well beyond the specific vampire mythology it borrows from Stoker's novel, connecting it instead to broader, more timeless questions about legacy, inherited responsibility, and the possibility of breaking free from patterns of suffering established long before any individual character was even born. Taken together, all of these layered cultural and historical influences reveal Van Helsing to be a film far more densely woven with literary and cinematic history than its reputation as a straightforward, effects-heavy action blockbuster might initially suggest. Beneath its surface-level spectacle of exploding castles, transforming werewolves, and swashbuckling monster-hunting adventure lies a genuine, if occasionally messy, attempt to synthesize over 2 centuries of Gothic literary tradition, Eastern European folklore, and classic American horror cinema into a single, unified narrative experience. Whatever one's ultimate assessment of how successfully the film balanced all of these ambitious influences, there is no denying that Van Helsing represents a fascinating snapshot of how deeply embedded these classic monster archetypes remain within global popular culture, more than a century after Bram Stoker first put pen to paper describing a mysterious count residing in a remote Transylvanian castle, and nearly 70 years after Universal Pictures first brought these same monstrous figures to flickering black and white life on movie screens around the world. That brings us to the complete cultural and historical exploration of everything that shaped Van Helsing, from the real historical figures and centuries-old folklore behind its monsters to the decades of cinematic tradition it was consciously built to honor. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history behind the film, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow movie lovers, and subscribe to Review and Facts for more detailed breakdowns just like this one.